Waters, literally, the waters are receding, going, and returning in Hebrew. This is moving water. As the waters are receding, they're moving. What does moving water do? It carries sediments. And so in the recessional phase of the flood, the waters are going to be moving. Some of the sediments that were deposited in the first half of the flood are going to be moved somewhere else. Psalm 104 also alludes to the flood. Many people say this is a creation passage, this whole psalm, but I don't think so. I think if we look carefully at verses 8 and 9, it is talking about the flood. It says that the mountains rose and the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth. If that's referring to the third day of creation when God made dry land, then the flood was a violation of that statement. I think that is a statement about the flood. And it tells us that the land mass, the crust of the earth, shifted in the recessional stage of the flood. And so the mountains rose and the valleys sank. Now, if you combine earthquakes and volcanoes, like the earthquake that we saw in Turkey a few years ago, with floods, like the one in Nicaragua a few years ago, you are going to have a catastrophe of unimaginable magnitude. Now look at that water. Wouldn't you like to just take a cup and just scoop in there and get a drink? Why does it look so brown? It looks brown because it's carrying sediments. And if we could do a stop-action cut through that water, we would find that that water is not just carrying microscopic particles of silt and maybe some sand grains. It's carrying boulders. And that house didn't last very long, I'm sure. And so the flood was a violent, violent catastrophe. All of the plant materials ripped up off the land. All the land creatures were drowned in the flood, taken from whatever they were hanging on to. And there was massive, massive erosion and sedimentation going on. Then there's the depth of the flood. The Bible tells us how deep it was in Genesis 7. It says, the waters prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. Now, let's suppose that we're all mountains in here, and let's suppose that this little thing here is like Elijah's jar, or was it Elisha, the jar of oil that never ran out. And I start pouring water on the mountains down here. What's going to happen? Well, the water's just going to pile up on top of their head, isn't it? No. It's water seeks a level plain. It's going to run down the shoulders. And so if I want to cover this mountain, I'm going to have to cover a lot of other mountains. But I'm a mountain too, so I've got to keep pouring to cover me. But we got a problem. The doors in the auditorium here are not watertight. The water's going to leak out the doors. It's going to go down the road to the campground here. And then it's going to go down the roads to Harrison. And so I'm going to have to pour a lot of water just to get this mountain covered. The only way to get all the high mountains under heaven covered is a global flood. Those who believe in a local flood believe that it was in the Mesopotamian valley. And to believe in a local flood, you've got to believe in something like this. Now, this is not an actual photograph. This is an artistic design by one of our artists in our office. No such flood really exists in the world. Never has. The only way you could have a flood like this is if God put His hands around all that water and kept it all contained. There's a problem with that view, though. There's nothing in the text of Genesis that says God did any kind of supernatural action like that. On the contrary, the whole text of the flood account is going out of its way to tell us He didn't do anything like that He was destroying the whole world. Then finally, for this discussion, the rainbow promise. In Genesis 9, we have the promise that God will never again send a flood on the earth, and the rainbow is the sign of that promise. This passage is one of those passages that causes me to think, you know, Lord, the Bible is awful long, and it takes a lot to read it. It would help if you'd not repeat yourself, you know. Just put it down once, and then we can get on to the next topic. But if you read this passage, God repeats himself over and over and over again. And that should lead us to a very important Bible study principle. That is, if God repeats himself, you should say, I think he's trying to emphasize something. And who did God make the promise to? He did not make the promise to Noah. He made the promise to Noah and all of his descendants, the animals and all their offspring, the birds and all their offsprings, and he made the promise to the earth itself. If the flood was local, God lied. Because there have been many local floods that have destroyed some animals and some people and some of the earth. But only a global flood fits the rainbow promise. When God said he would never destroy the earth again, that is exactly what he meant. And therefore, every time we see a rainbow, we should remember that God flooded this world with a global flood. It should be a sober reminder to us of a historical event. Now, what would you expect from a global flood that lasted 371 days, from the day that Noah got on the ark until the day he and the animals came off the ark, as it's described in Genesis? Well, you should expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers that were once soft sediments laid down by water. And you should expect to find that all over the earth. And that's precisely what we find. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. But that rock layer of fossils is a record of death. The evolutionists tell us that's the evidence of millions of years. So you can't really believe in Noah's flood as a global catastrophe and believe in millions of years at the same time. Because if the evidence is evidence of millions of years, if the rock record is evidence of millions of years, then it can't be evidence of Noah's flood. And if it's evidence of Noah's flood, it can't be evidence of millions of years. Now, there are theologians and Bible scholars out there who believe in both a global flood and millions of years, but they haven't thought the issue through. They're being inconsistent. They don't understand the significance of the geological record. Now, let's look at the geology. And to do that, I want to take you back first to the 19th century to help you understand the geology. And in the early 19th century is when the idea of millions of years was born. Up until that time, the biblical and traditional view, which was defended by a group of men that I studied in my PhD called the scriptural geologists, they believed what had been believed for 18 centuries in the church, and that was that there was a supernatural creation week, SCW, and God created everything in 6 literal days about 6,000 years ago, and that was followed about 1,600 years later by the flood, and then things continued up to P, the present time, and then they believed that there would be a supernatural ending, SE, to the world when Jesus Christ came again. That view was replaced in the early 19th century, first by the catastrophist view. There were 2 very influential men in development of that view, Cuvier and Smith, a Frenchman and an Englishman, respectively. And they believed in a supernatural beginning. They believed in God, but they didn't believe the biblical account of history. And so they imagined that over the course of untold ages, millions of years, every so often there was a regional or global catastrophe that destroyed much of the earth and much of the life on the earth. And then after each catastrophe, God supernaturally created new forms of life to replace the creatures that had died in that catastrophe. And then things went along for long ages, and then there was another regional or global catastrophe. So this was the catastrophist view. And because they viewed these catastrophes as natural, there might be a future catastrophe of this magnitude. And they maybe believed in a natural ending, but their writings don't really indicate what they believed about the future. That view reigned in geology for about 30 years. But by about 1830, it was replaced by the uniformitarian view. And this view said there have been no regional or global catastrophes in Earth history. The processes of geological change have been uniform all throughout history. Now, the uniformitarians maybe believed in a supernatural beginning. Some of them maybe didn't even believe that there was a beginning, believed in an eternal earth. But they didn't talk about that very much. But you see, there are no seas on the line. Earthquake here, a volcano there, a small flood here, just like we see on average during the course of a year today. Those have happened all throughout history. And the uniformitarian view, by about 1840, became the ruling dogma of geology. About 1840 is when geology became a profession. That's about the time that you were able, for the first time in history, to get a degree at the university in geology. And so from that time on, everybody was trained with a uniformitarian view of Earth history. And the journals, the science journals, the geological associations were controlled by this uniformitarian view. Now, I say all that so that you can understand this quote that I'm going to read to you by an evolutionary geologist who died just a few years ago. And I'm quoting from a book in which a few pages before this quote, he actually warned people like me, young Earth creationists, from using anything in his book to support my view. But Dr. Ager is dead now, and so I don't really care what he thinks. And what's truth is truth. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, so I'm going to use it anyway. And he now knows his views are wrong anyway. So he's talking about the stratigraphic record, the nature of the strata. And he's got a chapter in there on the history of the early 19th century in geology, and he makes this statement. As far as I can tell from his writings, he was an atheist until his death. My excuse for this lengthy and amateur digression into history is that I've been trying to show how I think geology got into the hands of the theoreticians, in his mind those were the uniformitarians, who were conditioned by the social and political history of their day more than by observations in the field. Now that is a very significant statement. He's saying, and I think he's right, that the uniformitarians were controlled and influenced in their interpretation of the rocks more by social and political ideas than by the actual rocks themselves. He goes on to say this. In other words, and he's writing to his fellow evolutionary geologists, we have allowed ourselves to be, what's that word? Brainwashed. That's not my word, that's his word. Brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme or what might be termed catastrophic processes. So here's what he's saying. I took geology in high school and I learned it with a uniformitarian perspective. I went to undergraduate. I learned geology from a uniformitarian perspective. I went on to get my PhD, taught by uniformitarian geologists. I went out and looked at the rocks, and I was thinking like a uniformitarian. But Dr. Ager was a world-class geologist. He studied on-location geological formations in over 50 countries. And the more he looked at the rocks, the more he began to say, these rocks are screaming catastrophe. The way I was trained to think in school was wrong. I was brainwashed. The evidence of catastrophe was always there, but I couldn't see it because of this brainwashing. Let me illustrate. What's missing in this picture? What was it originally? I'll give you a moment to think about that, and then we'll have a little quiz. Okay? Was the original picture A? Anybody want to vote for A? Okay? How about B? Was that what the picture was originally? C? Anybody want to vote for that one? Okay? This is what most of you will probably vote for, as my past experience would suggest. Was that it? Yeah. Nope. The answer is nothing is missing. It was drawn that way. Now what happened? I brainwashed you. I brainwashed you by asking a simple question. What's missing? And what I did was I influenced your mind to think something is missing. I got to figure out what's missing because you asked the question. I brainwashed you. I got you to think the way I wanted you to think. So, we all have the same facts. The evolutionists and the creationist geologists, they have the same Grand Canyon, they have the same fossils, they have the same rock formations, but depending on the starting assumptions will affect not only what you see, but how you interpret what you see. So, Dr. Ager is saying, I was brainwashed with a uniformitarian view, set of assumptions, slow, gradual processes, no catastrophes in Earth history of regional or global magnitude. And so when I went out and looked at the rocks, I couldn't see any evidence of catastrophe. But it was more and more observations of the real world that began to show him that the assumptions were wrong. And so he says, if you go out without ruling out a regional or global catastrophe before you ever look at the evidence, you'll actually see the evidence. Now, these kinds of geologists are called neo-catastrophists. Neo from Latin for new. And they are going back to some of the ideas of the early 19th century catastrophists. Now, the neo-catastrophists are still evolutionists. They still believe in millions of years. So they say, you know, if you look at that bottom layer there, let's say that shale, and if you don't look at it with uniformitarian assumptions, you will see evidence in that rock formation that it was formed catastrophically, rapidly. And then if you look at this next layer, let's say it's sandstone, and you look at it without uniformitarian assumptions, without ruling out catastrophe on a very high level, before you ever look at the rocks, you'll actually see evidence in the rock layers that they were laid down catastrophically, rapidly. And if you look at the next layer, the same will be the case. And so they see this evidence of catastrophe. Dr. Ager said that much of the geological record shows evidence of catastrophic formation, but he still believes in the millions of years. So where do they put the time? In between the layers, where there is no evidence. That's convenient. Now the creationist geologists come along and say, now you neo-catastrophists are on the right track. There is evidence in those layers that they were formed catastrophically and rapidly. But if you didn't start, you neo-catastrophists, if you didn't start with the anti-biblical assumption that ruled out a global flood before you ever started to look at the evidence, and if you looked more carefully at that boundary, you would see that there's no evidence of long passages of millions or thousands of years. There's evidence that this was laid down in rapid succession. Let me give you just one example. Here is a cross-section of the southwest United States where the Grand Canyon is located. Here's the Grand Canyon, and when you stand at the Grand Canyon, you see those rock layers on the other side, and they look just like pancakes. And we can trace those rock layers for hundreds, in some cases thousands of miles, and they're just as flat as pancakes. But look at the topography of the southwest United States. We see not only this huge canyon, which is 4 to 18 miles wide and 270 miles long and a mile deep, but we see these other erosional features that look like the ancient shorelines of a huge lake or ocean. But look at those layers in the canyon. We don't see any of those features, which we would expect to see if there was a long passage of time. Now, how long does it take to make fossils? Let's talk about that for a moment. Here's an interesting statement from some evolutionists, no friends of creation or the Bible. They say in a book on dinosaurs, fossilization is a process that can take anything from a few hours to millions of years. Now stop right there and think. One of the things you have to do as you read what evolutionists say is you need to read the sentence and then you need to back up and read it again more slowly. How do they know that fossilization can take millions of years? Has any geologist lived long enough to observe that as empirical observational science? Well, of course not. Has the science of geology been in existence long enough that you could string together overlapping careers of scientists so they could all share their notebooks and say, we've observed empirically that it takes millions of years for a fossil to form? No, the science of geology has only been in existence about 200 years. So how do they know it takes millions of years for fossilization to happen? The answer is, they don't. It's an assumption. It's a belief. Well, how do they know it takes a few hours? Now we're on to empirical observational science. They go on to say, the amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralized is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Modern bones that fall into mineral springs can become permineralized within a matter of weeks. Well, now Noah's flood was 4,000 years ago. And what would we have with Noah's flood? We would have groundwater heavily laden with minerals. as the land is being ripped up and pulverized. We need to understand that fossils do not come